My name is Hazel Briggs, and I'll be honest. Before that 4th of July weekend, I thought the hardest thing I'd ever survive was my divorce. I was 32, an ER nurse working 12-hour shifts at St. Lade Augustine's in Columbus, Ohio, raising my 9-year-old son Eli on my own, and I genuinely believed I had already hit the floor. Turns out, the floor had a basement. Eli is the kind of kid who collects things, not toys exactly, but skills. He taught himself origami from YouTube tutorials when he was 6. At 7, he convinced me to let him grow tomatoes in our apartment balcony, and he actually kept them alive. This past spring, he'd gotten obsessed with building model cars. Not the snap-together kind. The ones with actual tiny screws and paint and decals you apply with tweezers. He had 4 of them lined up on his windowsill, each one better than the last, and he talked about them the way some kids talk about sports teams. With reverence, like they mattered. His birthday is June 28th. He turned 9 this year, and he'd been asking for one specific kit since March, the 1967 Shelby GT 500, a 1008 scale model that cost me $140 and 2 weeks of planning to track down. I ordered it from a specialty shop in Michigan. It came in a massive box, and when I hid it in my closet, Eli walked by and didn't even glance at the door. He trusted me to keep his surprises safe. I should have trusted my gut to keep him safe from my brother. My younger brother Kyle is 30 years old, lives 40 minutes away in Dayton, and has been borrowing money from our family since he was 19. Not borrowing the way normal people borrow, borrowing the way a drain works. Slow, constant, never refilling. He's had 4 jobs in 5 years. The last one, he told us he quit because his manager didn't respect his ideas. His ideas, as far as I could tell, involved showing up late and leaving early. When I pointed this out once, my father told me I was being too hard on him. Kyle's sensitive, he said. Kyle's still finding himself. Kyle is 30. I found myself at 17 when I took my first waitressing shift to help with groceries. But sure, our dad, Raymond, retired early from his factory job and now fills his days puttering in his garage and watching Kyle orbit around him like a moon that never quite escapes. My dad isn't cruel. I want to be clear about that. He's not a bad person. He's just spent so long protecting Kyle from consequences that he's forgotten what consequences are supposed to teach you. Every time Kyle needed rent money, Dad was there. Every time Kyle had a setback, Dad smoothed it over. And every time I said something about it, Dad looked at me the same way, tired, patient, a little disappointed, like I was the problem for noticing. My mum passed 4 years ago. Breast cancer, stage 4, gone in 8 months. After that, Dad leaned harder into Kyle, and Kyle leaned harder into the money. I think grief does strange things to people. I think Dad needed someone to take care of. I just wish he'd chosen someone who appreciated it. The 4th of July gathering was Dad's idea. He'd rented a cabin outside of Hocking Hills for the long weekend. 3 days, the whole family, fireworks on the lake Friday night. He does it every few years when he's feeling sentimental and flush enough from his pension to spring for it. My Aunt Patricia, my mum's older sister, sharp as a tack and twice as funny, drove up from Louisville. My cousin Denise and her husband came from Pittsburgh, and Kyle showed up with his girlfriend, a quiet woman named Amber, who I'd met twice, and who seemed to have permanently apologized eyes, like she was always bracing for something to go wrong. Eli was electric about the whole thing. He packed his own bag 2 days early, swimming shorts, bug spray, free library books, and a notebook for nature drawings. He asked me 4 times if there would be fireflies. Every time I said probably, he looked like I'd handed him something precious. The morning we left, I loaded the car and put Eli's birthday presents in the back. 2 packages, the model car kit and a smaller gift, a set of professional-grade coloured pencils he'd been eyeing. I'd bought them both with my last overtime check. I didn't mention them to anyone because I wanted Saturday to be a surprise. We drove down with the windows cracked, Eli narrating everything he saw out the window, a hawk on a fence post, a field of sunflowers, a barn painted like an American flag. For those 2 hours, everything was good. I should have turned around anyway. The cabin was beautiful in the way that makes you briefly believe everything is fine. Wooden wraparound porch, a dock that jutted out over a green-blue lake, ceiling fans that clicked softly in every room. Dad was already there when we arrived, standing at the grill with the spatula and the expression he always wears when he's happy, quiet, a little proud, like he built the lake himself. Eli sprinted out of the car and straight to the water's edge to look for frogs. Patricia appeared from the porch with a glass of iced tea and pulled me into a long hug. "Same circus," she murmured into my shoulder. I laughed for real. I hadn't laughed like that in days. Carl arrived that evening with Amber, a six-pack of craft beer he definitely didn't pay for, and a new watch on his wrist that I didn't ask about. He greeted Eli with a fist bump and me with a nod, the kind that said we'd established years ago not to hug. Dad lit up when he walked in. "There he is," he said, like Kyle was returning from something heroic. That night we sat on the dock after dinner, watching the fireworks over the lake. Eli fell asleep against my shoulder somewhere between the red bursts and the gold ones, his froggy notebook still open in his lap. I carried him inside and tucked him in, and for a moment I stood in the doorway of the little bunk room thinking, this is okay, we can do this. One weekend, Saturday was his birthday. I got up early to set up. Patricia helped me tape a banner to the porch railing, "Happy Birthday Eli," which he had specifically requested in blue because blue is his favorite. Dad made pancakes with blueberries. Eli came downstairs with his hair sideways and his eyes barely open and said, "Oh," and then he smiled so wide I had to look away because it made my chest hurt. The gifts were stacked by the window. I brought them in from the car that morning, wrapped and ribboned, and I set them on the side table near the couch. We were going to do presents after lunch. Eli knew this. He walked past them at least 6 times before noon, not touching, just registering, the way he does when he's exercising patience like it's a muscle. Lunch was burgers and corn on the cob. We ate on the porch. Kyle ate 3 burgers and barely spoke, which I'd learned to take as a good sign. Amber helped Denise with the condiments. Dad told a story about the summer he and Mom had driven through Hocking Hills before they were married, and Patricia filled in the parts he misremembered, and for 20 minutes we were almost a normal family. Then I went inside to get the cake from the fridge. I was in the kitchen for maybe 10 minutes. I remember the exact sounds: the screen door banging twice, kids splashing somewhere on the dock, Patricia laughing at something Dad said. I pulled out the cake, a marble one from the bakery, with a little model car made of fondant on top, because the woman at the shop was an artist and I'd asked nicely and tipped well. I carried it back to the porch. Eli wasn't there. I set the cake down and looked around. The porch was full of people. Denise's husband was checking his phone. Amber was pouring lemonade. My dad was still talking. "Where's Eli?" I asked. Dad glanced up. He went inside a little while ago. Kyle took him up to show him something. I felt it then. The same thing I'd felt 100 times on 12-hour shifts, when something in an exam room shifted without obvious cause. A wrongness in the air, a too quiet that means something you can't name yet. I set the cake down and walked inside. The main room was empty. I went to the stairs and listened. Then I heard it. Not laughter. Not the particular shrieking joy sound Eli makes when something surprises him. It was a sound I'd only ever heard from him once before, when he was 5 and fell off a swing. The stunned, airless kind of crying that comes before the real crying starts. I went up those stairs faster than I've moved in a long time. Kyle was in the hallway outside the bunk room, leaning against the wall with his phone out. He looked up when he heard me and something moved across his face. Not guilt exactly. Something more like readiness. "He's fine," he said before I even asked. I was just showing him something. "Relax, Hazel." The door to the bunk room was half open. I pushed it the rest of the way. Eli was sitting on the bottom bunk with his knees pulled to his chest, and his face was doing the thing it does when he's trying very hard not to fall apart in front of people. He looked at me and his bottom lip started shaking. The box for the Shelby GT500 was on the bed beside him. Open. Empty. I stared at it for a second. Then I looked at my son. Then I looked at my son. Then I looked at the box again. "What happened?" I said. My voice was too quiet. I already knew that was a bad sign. Ely pressed his lips together. Uncle Kyle said he needed it. He said he'd bring it back. I turned around. Kyle was still in the hall, phone in hand, and now he had on the expression I'd been watching him wear since we were kids. The one that's not quite a smile but close enough to function as one. Casual, unbothered, preemptively blameless. "Where is it?" I asked. He exhaled like I was boring him. "I just borrowed it temporarily. I've got a guy who does buy-sell stuff. I was going to flip it and give you the cash. You spent too much on that anyway," he said. "It's a kid's toy. He'll forget about it by tomorrow." He took it from the box, I realized. He had opened my son's birthday present, today, on his birthday, and taken the contents to sell them. Eli had watched this happen. "I need you to get it back right now," I said. Kyle spread his hands. "I already dropped it off. It's not like I can just—" "You dropped it off," I said. "Today. I ran out this morning," he said, and then he heard himself and stopped, because even he could see where that sentence was going. He'd planned it. He'd gotten up early and driven to the pawn shop before we were even awake. He'd been planning this before we arrived. I stepped back into the bunk room and crouched in front of Eli. I kept my voice level the way I do when I'm telling a family in the ER that I need them to stay calm even though nothing about this moment calls for calm. "Hey, I'm going to fix this, I promise. Are you okay?" He shook his head once, small and honest. "I know," I said. "I know. Give me a few minutes." I walked back into the hall. Kyle was still there, but his posture had shifted. He was reading the room now. "I'm going to need the name of the shop," I said. He gave me a look. "Hazel, don't make this into a whole thing. I'll get you the money eventually. The name of the shop." He told me. I went downstairs, picked up my phone, and called the shop. It was a place in Chillicothe, 30 minutes away. The man who answered, Jess. He bought a model car kit that morning. Sealed box. Paid $50 for it. Was it stolen? I said no, it was a misunderstanding. I needed to buy it back. He said he could hold it for 2 hours. I told Patricia what had happened in 20 seconds flat. Her face did something complicated and then settled into a specific kind of still I've only seen on her when she's made a decision. "Go," she said. "I'll handle things here." I got my keys and I drove to Chillicothe, alone, hands tight on the wheel, windows down because I needed air. I paid the man at the shop $135. He marked it up, because of course he did. And I drove back with Eli's birthday present sitting on the passenger seat like evidence. When I got back to the cabin, the porch was quiet in a different way than I'd left it. Patricia was sitting with my dad. Kyle was inside. Amber was nowhere visible. Denise and her husband had taken a walk or made themselves scarce, which amounted to the same thing. Dad stood up when he saw me come up the steps with the box. His face was doing something I hadn't seen in a while. Uncertainty. Real uncertainty, not just the mild discomfort of awkward family dinners. "Hazel." I held up my hand. "Not yet." I went upstairs and found Eli in the bunk room, lying on his back staring at the ceiling. I sat down beside him and set the box on the bed. He stared at it. Then he sat up and touched the corner of it, careful like it might disappear. "You got it back," he said. "I got it back." He looked at me for a long moment. His eyes were still red. "Did Uncle Kyle sell it?" "He tried to. I went and bought it back." He was quiet. Then he said, "Why does he do stuff like that?" "That's the question, isn't it?" I didn't have a clean answer, so I gave him the true one. Because he hasn't learned that things belong to other people, and because nobody's ever stopped him before. Ely thought about this. "Are you going to stop him?" "Yes," I said. "I am." I went downstairs. The kitchen smelled like burnt coffee and tension. Kyle was standing by the counter, and he'd adopted the expression he uses when he thinks contrition might get him somewhere. Shoulders dropped, eyes a little soft, voice already shaping itself into something that might sound like sorry if you didn't know what sorry actually sounded like. "I was going to pay you back," he started. I cut him off. "You took a birthday present from a 9-year-old on his birthday. You took it before he even got to open it. You got up this morning, drove to a pawn shop, and sold it for $50. It was an emergency." "What emergency?" I asked. "What actual emergency?" He pressed his lips together. I'd like the $50 back, I said. Right now. He stared at me. Kyle. $50. He pulled his wallet out, and I noticed it was new, leather, nicer than anything I owned, and counted out $50 like each bill was costing him personally. He set them on the counter between us. I picked up the money and I looked at him, really looked at him, the way I hadn't let myself in a long time because it hurt to see it clearly. He wasn't sorry. He was performing sorry because I had the receipts and an audience. If I'd come home empty-handed, he would have kept the $50 and told the story as a joke later. I called a family attorney I know from the hospital, I said. Not true yet, but it would be. Just to understand my options. In Ohio, theft from a family member is still theft. What you did this morning qualifies. His expression changed. Hazel, come on. I'm not pressing charges today, I said. I'm telling you, so you understand this isn't something I'm going to let sit. You're going to pay back the $135 I spent getting that kit back. You're going to do it in writing and you're going to do it by the end of the month. And if you don't, I'll file a report. He laughed, short and sharp. You wouldn't do that. Try me. He looked at me like I'd switched languages. Like the version of me who always softened things, who always let it go for the sake of keeping peace, had stepped outside and been replaced by someone he hadn't met. Dad appeared in the doorway. Both of us turned. Raymond stood there for a moment, reading the room. Then he looked at Kyle, and for the first time in a long time, his face wasn't doing the protecting thing. It was doing something older and quieter. Kyle, he said, did you take Eli's gift to sell it? Kyle opened his mouth. Dad held up a hand. Just tell me yes or no. A long pause. Then, I needed money. Dad closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he looked different. He looked like a man who'd been standing on a certain patch of ground for a long time and had just noticed it was giving way under him. You're going to pay your sister back, he said. Every dollar. And you're going to go upstairs and apologize to your nephew. Not to me. To him. Kyle stared at him. I'm not going to tell you again, Dad said. His voice was quiet. That was the most surprising part. Kyle left the kitchen. I stood there for a second. Then I sat down at the kitchen table because my legs had decided they were done holding me up. Dad sat across from me. He put his hands on the table and then he just looked at them. Big, weathered hands, the kind that used to fix things. I kept thinking he'd find his way on his own, Dad said finally. I kept thinking he just needed time. I know, I said. I made it worse. I know that too. He nodded slowly. I'm sorry, Hazel. For all the times I told you to let it go, I didn't say it was fine, because it wasn't. But I reached across and put my hand over his, briefly. We sat there quiet for a minute. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly. It was the beginning of something that might become forgiveness, which is as good as these things get when they're real. Upstairs, I could hear Kyle's voice. Low, flat, then Eli's shorter, then silence. When Eli came back downstairs 20 minutes later, his face had done the complicated journey from upset to something more neutral. He sat down at the kitchen table and looked at me. He said sorry, he reported. Was it a good sorry? He scrunched his nose. Kind of. Like a homework sorry. Not a real sorry. I pressed my lips together so I wouldn't smile, because it wasn't funny exactly, but it also was. It's a start, I said. We did the birthday cake late. Patricia lit the candles and sang off key on purpose, the way she always has, and Eli blew them out in one breath and looked smug about it. He opened the colored pencils first and went quiet the way he does when something lands exactly right. Then he unwrapped the box. The real box, the one I'd driven 60 miles round trip to rescue, and he ran his hands over the lid and exhaled. This is the one, he said. The GT 500. That's the one. He looked up at me. You drove to get it back. I drove to get it back. He thought about this. Were you really mad? I was extremely mad. He nodded with great seriousness. Good. We spent that evening on the porch. The sky did what it does in the hills in July. It turned colours I don't have names for before settling into full dark with more stars than Columbus ever shows. Ely sat beside me with a flashlight and his notebook, drawing beetles he found on the railing. Kyle and Amber left that night. He said they had somewhere to be. Nobody argued. Amber gave me a look on her way out. Brief, private, an entire conversation in 2 seconds. And I thought, she knows. She's been watching this for a long time. On the drive home Sunday, Eli had the model car box on his lap the whole way. He didn't open it, he just held it. At home, I gave him 3 days to finish the hardest parts of the build before I called the attorney. His name was Marcus Shelley, a family law specialist who did pro bono consultations on Tuesdays. He confirmed what I'd already suspected: what Kyle did constituted theft. The pawn shop transaction was documented, and the text I'd sent Kyle before leaving the cabin asking him to confirm the amount he owed me was admissible evidence if he didn't pay. I sent Kyle the repayment terms in a text. Formal, plain, no commentary. $135 by July 31st. Reply to confirm you received this. He didn't reply for 4 days. On the 5th day, I forwarded the text to my dad. Dad called Kyle within the hour. I don't know what was said. What I know is that Kyle texted me at 9 p.m. That night's "I'll Venmo you this week." He did. $135. No note. No sorry. Just the number, which somehow told the whole story. What Kyle didn't count on was Amber. She texted me 2 weeks after the 4th of July asking if we could meet for coffee. We sat across from each other at a diner near her apartment, and she told me she was leaving him. Not because of Eli's birthday, though that was part of it, but because it was the moment she finally let herself see the pattern she'd been explaining away for 2 years. The new wallet had been purchased with grocery money she'd given him for the week. The watch had been a gift from his dad that he'd planned to sell if things got tight again. The cabin weekend had cost her a tank of gas she couldn't spare because he'd spent their shared account down to $11 3 days before the trip. She looked tired and decided in equal measure. I told her she didn't need my permission to leave, but that I thought she was making the right call. She looked at me like nobody had said that to her in a while. I don't know what happened after that with them. That's not my story to tell. What I can tell you is that Kyle called me in August, voice stiff, and said Amber had moved out and somehow this was connected to me, and I told him calmly that Amber was her own person who made her own choices, and that if he wanted to talk about what was actually happening in his life, I was available. He hung up. Dad called me the same day. He said Kyle was having a hard time. I know, I said. But Dad, he's 30. At some point, the hard times have to teach him something, or they're just hard times. My father was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You sound like your mother." I didn't know what to do with that except cry a little bit after we hung up, which I did, quietly, in the bathroom with the fan on. 2 weeks into August, Eli finished the Shelby GT500. He set it on the windowsill next to his other 4 models and stood back and looked at the row of them, the way people look at things they made themselves, with a particular kind of ownership that comes from effort. He'd painted it the original red with a white racing stripe, and the decals were applied so cleanly the shop owner in Michigan would have approved. He called me over to look. "What do you think?" he asked. "I think it's the best one yet." He grinned. "I think so too." He paused. "Mom, what if Uncle Kyle had kept it? What would we have done?" I looked at the car, then at him. "We would have found another way. It might have taken longer. But you would have built it eventually. But it wouldn't have been the same one." "No," I said, "it wouldn't have been the same one. That's why I went and got it back." He seemed to be testing this against something in his own mind. Then he said, "People aren't supposed to take things that aren't theirs." "No, they're not, even if they say they'll give it back." "Especially then," I said. He nodded, satisfied. Then he went back to his windowsill and adjusted the car a 1/4 inch to the left and declared it done. I've been thinking about that moment lately. Not about Kyle, not about the pawn shop receipt I still have in my email archive, not about the $135. I've been thinking about Eli sitting on that bunk with his knees to his chest, not crying yet but close, and how he looked at me when I walked in. Not with the expectation that I'd fix it exactly, just with the absolute quiet certainty that I would try. I've been a nurse long enough to know that you can't protect people from everything. You can't stand between every hard thing and the person you love. But you can show them what it looks like to stand up anyway. You can let them watch you drive 30 miles and pay money you didn't have and come back with the thing that matters. Not because it was worth $135, but because it was his, and nobody gets to take what's his. That's the whole lesson. I didn't know it would fit in a model car box. But here we are,